is tomorrow. With me to comment on the German election is Dr. Gunnar Beck, which is a previous member of European Parliament for the Alternative from Deutschland, live now with me from Great Britain, actually, and not Germany this state. Have a good evening, Dr. Gunnar Beck. How are you?
And a good evening to you, Jacob. I'm all right. I'm curious to see what will happen tomorrow. Although, of course, we've had lots of polls.
Could you tell us a bit about what are the poll numbers at the moment for the AfD and the CDU in the German election?
Right. Well, we've had fairly consistent polling for quite a while now. The AfD is polling at about 21%, within a range of about 20 to 22 over the last few weeks. The CDU, somewhere around 30%. Recent opinion polls have ranged from something like 28 to 33. So the single or figures I've given you, they are the kind of average.
If we look at the current possible government that could be formed from this election, everything talks that it's going to be a CDU, a Christian Democratic government that's going to rule Germany. Will we still see, as you Germans love to have it, a gross coalition, a big coalition, where you always basically have the conservative Christian Democratic Party and you have the Social Democratic Party ruling? Is that going to be the next government of Germany, or will we see something different here? What's your take on this?
In Germany, nothing ever changes. Well, we've had a discussion a few weeks back, and I predicted that Merz's CDU will lead the coalition. But the big question is whether he'll need one or two partners. The most likely outcome is that he'll now need two partners. It still depends. It depends on whether some of the smaller parties will pass the so-called 5% hurdle in Germany. A party broadly speaking, they need 5% of the popular vote to gain representation in the German federal parliament. So there's a question whether the small liberal party, FDP, and the new Wagenknecht party, a kind of socially conservative, economically left-wing party, will be represented. If they are represented, then Merz will almost certainly need two other coalition partners. But even if they are not elected, there's still a fair chance he'll need a third partner for his coalition. So let's take the simpler case first. He'll go into government with the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats, and here I have to slightly correct you, you're right, there used to be one of the two natural governing parties in Germany, but they've lost a lot of voters over the last 20 years, and I think the last government was an exception. Scholz was very lucky because the media discredited the Christian Democratic candidate at the time 4 years ago. That's not happened this time. Scholz has performed dismally. So the Social Democrats, who obtained about 25% of the popular vote last time, are down to somewhere between 15 and 16.5% now. They've lost a third of their electorate. So it's unlikely that together with the CDU, they'll be able to form a government. But if they did, then it'd be a CDU-led government with the SPD as a junior partner. Now, that could mean that Merz will at least be able to push through some of his reforms on migration, whilst there be some resistance on economic reform, with the Social Democrats, not always decisive. So if there are two partners and the CDU leading the SPD, it would be a bad government, but not a catastrophic one. If there are three partners, it's going to be another catastrophe.
So one question, and I guess the answer is already no, but some people speculating, if you look at the current poll numbers, you can actually see that CDU, CSU, and AFD would have over 50% if the polls will be correct. But I presume that is out of the picture. That's not going to happen in German politics with coalition between those two parties.
Correct. I mean, practically all the polls we've had over the last 2 months would indicate that the CDU, CSU and the AFD would get an absolute majority in parliament, probably even of the popular vote. But the CDU has ruled out any coalition with the AFD, and I think it's not on the cards. So they're looking for other coalition partners. Number one partner would be the SPD. And then I think it's a toss between the FDP and the Greens. Oddly enough, it's more likely that Merz would enter into a coalition with the Greens as a third partner. Although in terms of economic politics or policies, the FDP is much closer to his own ideas. Why is that? Well, there's a big question mark that the FDP will make it at all. They're polling at 4 to 4.5% now. But even if they just scraped into parliament, well, one reason why I think Merz is unlikely to vote for the FDP, he's certain to vote against the AFD as a coalition partner. One reason why he's unlikely to go with the FDP is that relations between the SPD and the FDP are very strained now. Secondly, he may prefer the Greens because the Greens are very gung-ho in terms of the war against Russia. The FDP is fairly gung-ho, but not quite as enthusiastic. And Merz himself hasn't really distanced himself from the Green Deal. So again, he's got limited objections only to the kind of measures that the Greens have introduced in that regard over the last 3.5 years. Measures and policies that have had a catastrophic effect, not only on German living standards, but also on the competitiveness of German industry. Because, of course, energy prices in Germany have risen even faster than in the rest of Europe. In Germany, being the world's leading industrial economy, not the economy generally, of course, depends on steady and cheap supply of energy more than other countries.
So one question I have is, which policies has been dominating this election cycle? Is it security, the economy, migration, the war in Ukraine? What politics or debates are going to decide the outcome of the German election?
Well, all these topics have featured prominently. And the parties have been trying to stress whatever topic they think their own voters are most interested in and where they feel they would perform strongest. So, but in voters' minds, I think the key topics have been the economy, migration, and bound up with migration, of course, internal security, because I mean, you in Sweden have been familiar with the situation of quite some time now, but Germany's been catching up very rapidly. So there's been a dramatic increase in violent crime, and we are basically seeing a kind of major quasi-terrorist attack, generally by, well, always by immigrants, on a monthly basis now. And when it comes to knife attacks, rapes, that's commonplace now. You know, it's become a daily routine in Germany now.
If you look at the immigration debate in Germany, CDU, well, there's happened quite a bit, at least, not any major things, but the firewall got a hole in it before. I did an interview with you a couple of weeks ago about it, where the CDU actually took support from the AfD in the Bundestag to push through some how should we say, so a bit more stricter migration politics to Germany, and this was quite controversial. But is the CDU, I mean, it's the party of Angela Merkel, Wir schaffen das Merkel, that opened up Europe, and Sweden was not long behind you guys on this thing with the open border madness. Do people feel that the CDU have any kind of, can you trust them when it comes with their change in the, at least rhetorical change in the migration debate?
Well, don't ask me. I'm a bit of a cynic, and I truthfully trust no one in politics. When it comes to most people, yes, a fair number of people, to my own surprise and a little to my own dismay, still think the CDU is sincere when it is promising a significant change in its stance on migration. Now, I don't want to be too cynical. Merz has always been fairly conservative in a number of policy areas. I think it is quite possible. I mean, he was out of politics. He was a businessman and a practicing commercial lawyer at the time. He was Merkel's big rival 25 years back in her sort of inimitable East German way. She outmaneuvered him, and he didn't stay in politics. He went to make a lot of money working for US companies. But it's quite clear, he's indicated that fairly clearly, that he didn't support Merkel's opening of the borders in 2015. So I do think his skeptical attitude to Merkel's migration policy is quite authentic. But as I said, he's no island. He's the head of a party, at least a third, and maybe as much as 40 or 45% of that party is still a kind of Merkel fan club, especially the regional prime minister in his own region, North Rhine-Westphalia, which is where I come from as well. There, Mr. Wüst, the regional prime minister, is in a coalition with the Greens. And, you know, his policy stance is almost indistinguishable from the Greens. So within the CDU, there's still a kind of woke faction, and it's still very significant, almost indistinguishable from the Green Party. And then the second reason why he can't quite do what he may want to do is that he can't even govern just with the CDU. He has to look for coalition partners, certainly the SPD. And if on top of that, as I indicated, he's likely to take the Greens on board as well, then in fact, within the ruling coalition, he doesn't even have enough support, majority support, for his own stance on migration. He'll have to take on board not only his own liberal wing within his own party, but then there are the Social Democrats and the Greens, and they'll subvert almost any meaningful progress on migration. So I wouldn't be too hopeful in terms of any decisive change in policy. If he's governing with the Social Democrats only, there'll be a bit of movement. With the Greens, there'll be very little. Germany will remain the great harbinger of all self-destructive trends in Germany, in Europe.
There's this cynical Dr. Beck, as you said before. I'm going to open up for some questions from the chat. And one question here from one viewer is that, isn't Germany 10, 15 years behind every other European countries about that conservative parties don't want to rule together with nationalistic right-wing anti-establishment anti-immigration parties? And a second question on that, isn't this a losing strategy on the part of the CDU? So two questions in that sense.
Well, the answer to the first question is very simple. Yes, but I'd like to add a bit of explanation to that. And the reason is that Germany is still a deeply traumatized country. And I'm sure all your listeners will know what I'm referring to. Of course, it has to do with the war. The Germans, oddly enough, today are taught, I mean, young Germans are taught about the, well, they're taught they're taught very little history, except, of course, about the Third Reich. And they're told that the Germans are responsible for everything, not just the Second World War, but almost all other big injustices in world history, and that even those things they are not responsible for, or only responsible or only engaged in to a very small extent, like colonization, they still have a responsibility to make good the wrongs perpetrated by other countries. Once you're taught that at school, day in, day out, and once that sort of message has been inculcated in you through the public media for decades, then a considerable number of people have imbibed it. And the results you see today. So when Greens are telling Germany that with a share, the worldwide CO2 emissions of about 1.8%, Germany has a moral responsibility to save the climate. A surprising number of people actually believe this. And when they're telling Germans that they have a special responsibility to take in all the migrants, even if it leads more crime, even if it's economically self-destructive, a surprising number of people actually support this policy. I think the Germans are politically inept. I'm afraid that's simply the case. Or when I say, I mean, it's always, I'm generalizing now. I think Germany has always been a politically remarkably inept nations. The Germans have rarely had realistic objectives in their history, and in a curious sense, that's still true today, except now they don't wish to conquer the world any longer. They want to save the world. And in so doing, they remain very intolerant because they're implicating everyone else and they're telling them what to do as well. Okay, so that's probably my answer to your first question. But I have to admit that because I got so carried away, I've almost lost sight of the second.
The second question was, isn't this a losing strategy for the Christian Democratic, the conservative parties in Germany, that they don't want to cooperate in that sense? How do you see on that question?
That's difficult to answer. It's very speculative. And I think you may have to draw a distinction between short and long-term consequences. I agree with you. In the long term, yes, because I think the CDU is still the establishment party. And if the CDU changed direction, I think it is conceivable, at least, they'd vote back, they'd win back some of the voters they've lost to the CDU, to the AFD. But that's speculation. In the short term, I think it's a risky strategy for Merz, simply because the media in Germany, there have been some interesting surveys on that. About 2/3 of all journalists, print as well as media, including television, vote Green, right? So there'd be an indescribable media outrage against Merz if he did that. And that could cost him votes in the short term. More importantly, I think it could cost him his leadership in his own party. Because as I indicated, about 40% of the CDU is still firmly woke.
And one question here, and the problem with AFD is that they are openly pro-Putin, which exclude them from any significant gains in Western Germany or large cities. Is that something, if we take on the Putin question, because that is, if you read about the AFD in the Swedish media, you can basically summarize it with the AFD is a pro-Putin party. If we start with that, is the AFD a pro-Putin party, or could you elaborate a bit on that?
Pro-Putin, you said.
A pro-Putin party. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's true to say that the AFD has been consistently opposed to active Western involvement in the Ukraine war. For a variety of reasons, but primarily because it's not in Germany's interest. And if you look at the economic impact our confrontation has had with Russia, that's undoubtedly the case. So my own position, for example, which is not the most extreme pro, shall we say, or anti-Ukraine position within the party, but my own position is that clearly Russia was the aggressor in this. There's no question that Russia's entry into Ukraine violated international law. But of course, we have to realize that Russia is not the only one who's violated international law. Other countries are doing that all the time. That's proviso number 2. Secondly, the Ukraine conflict has a prehistory where NATO in particular led the Russians to believe for a very long time that Ukraine wouldn't become part of NATO. So the Russians finally reacted also to those assurances that turned out to be very hollow. But my key reason why it's not in Germany's interest to be opposed too openly and actively to Russia is that we simply cannot afford it. Germany's phased out nuclear energy. Our industry and our living standards depend on the supply of cheap Russian energy. We've seen the impact of cutting ourselves off from that supply. So I think we have very little choice in the matter. I think if you want to maintain German living standards and if our industries to remain competitive, you've not only got to change direction on migration, you've not only got to abandon those climate change policies. We simply have to restore energy supplies from Russia, because gas from other parts of the world, well, in fact, we are still importing a lot of gas from Russia. It's just channeled through third countries, and we pay about 3 or 3.5 times the price for it. So Russia is still selling its it's still selling energy. It's just that other countries profit, and the Russians themselves get a higher price than they would have charged us under the original agreements. So I'm not sure that sanctions are actually harming Russia. The evidence suggests the opposite. The Russian economy is performing rather better than most Western economies now. So I think the sanctions policy has been a failure. And I think from Germany's point of view, I simply have to invoke the national interest argument. We have a simple question. Either we try to reach an accommodation with Russia, or we ruin ourselves economically. I'd rather not ruin myself economically. I have to be blunt about that. I mean, that will shock some people, but on balance, I would probably support my party's stance on the matter, although, of course, I should distance myself from a number of people who adopt a rather too uncritical attitude in this regard. They wouldn't even acknowledge that Russia's start of the war was a violation of international law, and quite a few of our politicians have in the past been accused of actually taking money from Russian sources to promote Russia's point of view. Obviously, I'm not in any way countenancing such behavior. My stance on the matter is based purely on economic considerations and national self-interest. I simply feel, whether I'd like it or not, that we have no choice in the matter.
And I have another question, and you also mentioned it, the nuclear power, since the Scholz government, or well, Angela Merkel and the CDU started with the Energiewende, and then the Scholz government continued on those policies and shut down all the electrical nuclear power plants in Germany. That has caused that southern Sweden is in a really bad shape as well, since we get the German electricity prices there. How impactful has that decision been on these elections? Are the Germans growing tired of having extremely high electric prices, or do you still manage that?
I think the majority in Germany are skeptical of these decisions, but I think there's a surprising number of people who are still anti-nuclear. Yeah, I'm surprised by that. I mean, the Wall Street Journal called Germany's energy policy, after Germany announced they'd abandon nuclear energy and rely solely on cheap Russian imports and wind and solar energy. The Wall Street Journal has called Germany's decision, and you're right, it was Mrs. Merkel's decision originally, who was a kind of, Mrs. Merkel, we should remember, was a kind of avocado. She appeared black or conservative or sort of unassuming on the outside, but like any avocado, the interior is green. Right? And you may even say the core is brown, right? You know, what can you make of an energy policy for the world's leading industrial nation that's relying primarily on solar and wind energy, when in Germany the wind is always the wind isn't always blowing and the sun is rarely shining? It's a preposterous, it's the most idiotic energy policy ever implemented by any country, anywhere, at any time. I mean, Germany is the closest thing in our day and age to a complete idiocracy.
And I have another question here. Which topics in the election or things could actually sabotage it? Is there anything the AfD could do right now that could sabotage its chances well, it's less than 24 hours, or it's exactly almost 24 hours until the election station closes in Germany tomorrow. Yeah. But if we look at after the election here, is there anything the AfD could do to sabotage its chances for further growth in the future?
Well, I mean, the media have tried very hard, because every time there's an election, they either dig out or, more often, fabricate scandals. Before the European elections, there were accusations against several of our incoming MEPs about connections with Russia. Now, the investigations are still ongoing, and there may well turn out to be some foundation for these charges, but so far the evidence is not unequivocal, right? So it's no coincidence that these matters are always brought up just before an election, and then it gets relatively quiet again. And in fact, in the past, yeah, I mean, I've myself been a victim of such allegations. The Germans made a fuss about whether or not I can call myself this, that, or the other. They've questioned whether I can call myself doctor, even though I have a doctorate from the University of Oxford, which I think is second to no university in Germany. And then, because my university prefers some old archaic job title, they've said, oh, you can't call yourself professor. And they tried to convict me under some law that was originally passed under the Nazis. So they're not afraid to use Nazi legislation when they are prosecuting AfD politicians. And there have been other ridiculous charges, most of which have been disproved. But this time it's been remarkably quieter. There have been some allegations made against Mrs. Weidel over some unwise remarks she may have made about Hitler having been a communist, or some other matters. And, you know, they've labored the topic of her living in Switzerland rather than Germany, but they've not had the same impact. So the long and the short of my answer is really, in order to discredit the AfD, the media and the other parties have largely relied on scandals. I think that's because that's been the case for 10 years now. That's gradually wearing off, because a lot of people are realizing that it's very odd that only we should have scandals and that the other parties should never have any, or if there are any, they're always suppressed by the judicial authorities. Besides, many of those scandals have turned out to be a great deal of trara about absolutely nothing, much ado about nothing. So I think that's probably what the AfD has to be most afraid of, for as long as it's not been in government. When it comes to its stance on most policies, of course, a sizable majority of Germans, or a sizable number of Germans, don't like those policies. We will never convert anyone who's genuinely a green voter. But I think as the economic situation worsens, I think people see the point of what the AfD has been saying. And of course, most of the predictions the AfD has made have broadly turned out to be true. I mean, I've been in the habit of making apocalyptic predictions about Germany for the last 15 years. And I'm very sorry to say that each and every one of them has come true or is coming true. I'm still, I mean, with every prediction I'm making, I'm hoping that it will not come true, but sadly, it generally does. So that I think the AfD is on fairly safe ground, while it's not been in government, because the economic situation in Germany will continue to worsen. Of course, if it ever got a chance of government participation, then it becomes tricky because the AFD will be implicated. And then if nothing much changes and things were to worsen, well, then of course we have to see. I think that could be a great danger. There is, of course, a related problem, namely that the AFD has very rapidly become like any other political party. So a career in the AFD is now largely depends on promotion within the AFD by certain networks, and competence as may not necessarily rank most prominently. So the AFD, if it ever were to get into government, would really have to prove itself. Now, I'm not saying there are no competent people, absolutely not true, but I think once you're in government, the test will be decisive, and you need a broad base of really qualified people, not just professional politicos. And I think that will be a danger for the AFD, just as it would be for other parties, just as it has been for other parties. And of course, the Greens experienced a huge surge in popular support for years. And then it turned out that none of their politicians really had any grasp of any of the portfolios they were supposed to take charge of. Mr. Habeck is a former children's books author, and he was appointed economics minister. And it transpired that he didn't even know the meaning of the word insolvency or bankruptcy. And Mrs. Baerbock, well, I don't have to go on about her. She once declared war on Russia by mistake, and she asked Mr. Putin to make a 360 degree turn before the West could enter into negotiations. The Russian foreign minister, spokeswoman for the spokeswoman for the Russian foreign ministry, in response said, well, if Germany's foreign minister doesn't graduate in at least one primary school subject very soon, then Germany has a problem. You know, that's the level we have in government now. And I think it's quite frightening, the sort of level of incompetence amongst many of Germany's politicos.
And some things that people really couldn't see, but with the new presidential administration, the Trump administration in the United States, the AFD first got support from Elon Musk, that runs the Doge department. And then we had J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. And he also spoke with Alice Weidel after the conference and told this, and well, he said as well in his speech, the time for the firewall, it needs to be put out now. How does that impact the election in Germany? Will that make the German electorate angry? Will that help normalize the AFD? What's the outcome of the support from these leading American politicians and policymakers?
Well, it's been the kiss of luck, hasn't it? Fortune has smiled on the AFD.
You didn't predict that.
No. No one predicted that. And I mean, the reaction within the AFD has been very decisive. I mean, from, there have been a number of characters who've been very vocal in that kind of Eastern orientation in the past. And even the most vocal Easterners suddenly became Trumpists, right? So it doesn't take very much. The AFD was so entranced by the sudden and unexpected support it got from across the pond, that the party just, it was transfixed and turned to Trump and Musk in gratitude. So it shows the degree of flexibility. There is still, or the potential for flexibility on foreign policy issues within the party. I think that's a further comment in relation to your previous listener. You know, it shows that this thing is not cast in stone. It was largely because the West was just denouncing us to a large extent, but if there's actually a sympathetic government in the biggest and most powerful country in the world, then I think the AfD is influenced by that too. But your question is really about the kind of electoral consequences of this. I think it's been helpful. I mean, the AfD was polling all right. Before it was polling at 18, 90, sometimes 20%, but I'm quite sure it's gained about 2, possibly 3 percentage points as a result of the added legitimacy it now has in the eyes of German voters. Of course, the German establishment has denounced these comments as foreign interference in the German government.
But Mrs. Baerbock hasn't declared war on the United States yet, at least.
No, Mrs. Baerbock hasn't done that. She's been too confused as a result. Yeah, I think that may persuade some people. But by and large, whatever is said in the United States, Germans still take heed of. There's sometimes criticism of the US on certain specific issues. But by and large, most Germans realize that the US is the great overlord and that you cannot ignore US positions. Now, of course, it's still early days for Trump. I think he's only been in office for around about a month. And we have to see whether he'll keep up his energetic pace of change, which has been astounding, and whether the opposition to Trump that undoubtedly exists in the United States will reorganize itself and start effectively subverting his policies, as they did quite successfully when he was in office for the first time. But if Trump were to succeed with his current pace of reform, then I think the kind of friendly, helping hand that's been offered to the AfD from across the Atlantic will prove even more persuasive and an electoral asset over the next few years. Let's just assume the following. Merkel enters, Merkel is still omnipresent. She's the great vector of modern Germany.
The great zeitgeist.
I'm afraid so, yes. I mean, if Merz were forced in or entered into a coalition with both the SPD and the Greens and made pretty much no headway in terms of economic reforms or reforms on migration, if the economy continued to decline, if that decline even accelerated, well, then obviously support for the AfD could rise further. And if then, at some stage, he receives a phone call from Washington that really he has to get his act together and consider an alliance with the AfD, because Germany can't be allowed to become a kind of strange mixture of hippie community and a center of Islamic radicalism, and perhaps even the kind of embryonic center of a caliphate, a European caliphate. Well, then I wonder what he'll be doing. You know, he's made his personal fortune working for American law firms and BlackRock. So once BlackRock is supporting Trump and he receives his BlackRock phone call, then I predict anything will become possible. I think that's the only scenario where I could see the AfD could ever get into a government. If Trump is so successful in the US that German establishment parties receive a phone call, more or less an order from the US that they've really got to be reasonable now.
I just want to, we're going to take a few more questions and talk for about 15 more minutes. But I just want to show a clip that Alice Weidel put on into X, and I'm going to play it here. It's a bit on how the AfD communicates in this election cycle. So I'm going to play this clip here. It's
strongly support AfD. Go.
There's no room for firewalls.
Je mehr AfD, desto besser für Deutschland.
Mehrere schimpfen mit euch. Jeder kriegt seine Dankeschön.
Damit ist der Entschließungsantrag angenommen.
Zum ersten Mal wird ein Antrag im Bundestag erfolgreich, weil er mit den Stimmen der AfD nur überhaupt möglich war.
Wir benennen als einzige die Ursachen.
Woher die kommen, das weiß man nicht. Das können Flüchtlinge sein, das können aber auch ein australischer Austauschstudent zum Beispiel sein.
Es ist die unkontrollierte Einwanderung.
I can't hear you presently.
Oh, sorry about that. You have quite a bit of energy in your political communication right now. Has this always been the case with the AfD, or is it a sudden Musk influence that caused this great impact of energy into your political communication?
I think it may have increased. I mean, as you will realize, as your listeners will realize from my own style, I'm a touch more laid back and rely almost exclusively on argument or irony. The party is a touch blunter in its approach, as of course it has to be with a general electorate. I think it's on the whole a strategy that's obviously been improved over recent years, but I think it's now operated very successfully. And I think that's very well done. And I think it's having an effect also on younger voters. So, but I don't think that's exclusive to the AfD. I think populist right-wing parties throughout Europe have been very successful in using or taking advantage of the only mass medium they've really enjoyed to promote their own ideas, namely the internet and social media. From my very limited knowledge of the Swedish Democrats, you know, I think they probably were one of the parties pioneering this approach. And if anything, I think they've taken it further than the AfD. So I think the AfD has modeled its own approach on some of the success of the other right-wing parties throughout Europe, the Austrian FPÖ, the Rassemblement, the Vlaams Belang in Belgium, and also the right-wing parties in Denmark and Sweden. So I think the AfD has learned, and I think I've always been a great advocate of transnational cooperation with our partners across Europe. The AfD is a relative latecomer and can profit from learning from the experience of others. And I think in that regard, the party's done so. And I think that's a jolly good thing.
I have one question here, and then I'm just going to ask one final question, and we'll round up from here. The question is, how large of a social impact do you have as an ordinary German if you say that you will vote for the AfD? Will people ask you if you're crazy, or are people being tolerant towards that? I guess in the more progressive areas of Berlin, you might not be that popular as a AfD voter, but how bad is it?
It depends on the region you're in. I think there's a clear urban-rural divide. I think your listener is absolutely spot on here. But I think there's a more obvious divide even, namely that between East and West Germany. If you look at a map of Germany with coloring based on which party will obtain the most votes in the country's constituencies, you see that the East is blue now. In almost all East German constituencies, the AfD comes first, and the West is entirely black, almost entirely black, with the CDU being the biggest party in most of the constituencies. So that's so in East Germany, it's okay. You can be a successful practicing lawyer or doctor openly admitting you are voting for the AfD. That's not generally possible in West Germany. And if you're a civil servant, I think it's almost lethal in West Germany. I think in West Germany, you will be vilified still, and you get into all sorts of trouble, especially if you are an active politician for the AfD, unless you know, some members in my own region, for example, of North Rhine-Westphalia, the regional association of the AfD is very pacific. It avoids all controversial topics, and that means that the authorities are relatively hands-off. But if you really don't shirk from calling a spade a spade, then I think you have a rough time. So I think that's a very valid observation by your listener. It's not easy, certainly in West Germany.
I think a lot of the listeners or viewers are probably aligned with the Swedish Democratic Party. It's been quite similar in Sweden for a long time. And one final question then, as you said, you love to make predictions. Please give me your predictions for tomorrow's results, Dr. Gunnar Beck. What will happen? What percentage will the AfD have? Will we see a great political earthquake going on, or is it going? Are the polls correct, or will we see something more? What's your prediction?
Generally, I think polling in Germany is fairly reliable. That was the experience with the last federal election and also the European elections. So I'd expect the outcome to be broadly in line with the polls. So I'd say the CDU will get around 30%, probably a bit better. That's my sense. AfD will get around 20%. Social Democrats around 16%, Greens surprisingly still 14%, which just means that 14% of the German electorate are straightforwardly insane. And then I think it's too tight. The Linke, the left-wing party, the former East German Communist Party, will do surprisingly well. They are almost like the Green Party, but the Green Party wants to spend all our money on Ukraine, climate change, and more and more migrants. The left-wing party wants to spend it on climate change, ever more migrants, but also on Germans. So they want to spend it, poor Germans, they want to spend even more. So they will do surprisingly well. They will get around 7 to 8%. And then there's a real question whether the Free Democrats and and the Wagenknecht party will get in. I cannot predict because I'm too out of touch with these parties. It could happen, it might happen, it might not. I simply don't know. But my prediction is you certainly get a grand coalition, and it will be one of the very grand, not in terms of stature, but in terms of large. So 3 parties, that's the most likely outcome. Nothing much will happen. The malaise will continue, and I don't think we'll see much improvement in Germany. Germany is in the process of writing itself out of history, and I think this will sadly continue.
I for once hope you're wrong here, Gunnar Beck.
You're wrong. I always do.
And as a final gesture of gratitude for you spending 1 hour, I'm going to say, vielen Dank, Gunnar Beck, dass Sie meine Fragen beantwortet haben. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Abend und viel Erfolg bei der Wahl. That's 5 years of public German in public school. So,
single grammatical error. So my congratulations on your German. Thank you for inviting me. My thanks to your listeners too for asking very well informed and interesting questions, which allowed me to refine some of my views. I hope I've not offended anyone. If I did, I can't help it either. But no, it was a great pleasure. Always very good to be invited by you. These are amongst the most enjoyable things.
Thank you very much. And we would love to have you on after the elections to see if you could predict the future correctly this time as well or not. So thank you so much, Dr. Gunnar Beck.
Let's hope not. Let's hope I will. Thank you. All the best. Thank you. Goodbye.
Yeah, have a lovely evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye to you.